Well, it's happening. We are finally getting a new Lord of the Rings movie produced by Peter Jackson, Philippa Boyens, and Fran Walsh. And best of all, the movie will star and is being directed by Andy Serkis. The movie has a working title of The Hunt for Gollum, and loads of people are already speculating online about what this film could be about. You probably don't know me, even if you clicked on this video, because my channel is relatively new and I only have 3 videos, but trust me when I say I am one of the internet's resident Tolkien nerds. I have this, I have these, and I'm also the King of Gondor, but they didn't make the crown the right size, so I understand the confusion. And obviously having these things doesn't prove I'm the world's biggest Tolkien fan, but trust me when I say I know my stuff. And today I want to walk you through 3 of the main sources of Tolkien's writings of the time period where this film is likely going to take place. And that's between The Hobbit and The Lord of the Rings. If there's more than these 3, and honestly there may be, please feel free to revoke my Tolkien card. The first source is one that most people have probably read already because it comes in the Fellowship of the Ring book when Legolas tells the Council of Elrond that Gollum was being held captive in Mirkwood. It's a conversation that doesn't happen in the movies, and it'll likely be a surprise to the fans of just the films. Legolas came to the Council of Elrond mostly to bring this news of Gollum. He shares that the elves have interrogated Gollum in Mirkwood and that Gollum has been through Mordor in his quest to regain the ring. The council deduces that this is how Sauron now knows that the ring is found and that it is in the Shire. Boromir then asks what fate befell Gollum after he confessed these secrets, and Aragorn chimes in, saying that Gollum is now being held captive in Mirkwood, and he's glad he's there because he fears that Gollum was released from Mordor to continue on his evil errand. However, this is when Legolas reveals the worst of his news, that Gollum has actually escaped his captivity in Mirkwood. He claims that after a while, the elves just did not have the heart to keep Gollum captive in their dungeons under the earth. He says that the elves actually let Gollum into the woods on fair weather days, and that he actually started to love climbing trees. They also said that one day he went up a tree and didn't want to come down, and they didn't want to go fishing through the branches for him, so they stationed some elves under the bottom of the tree until he had to come down. But on that same day, a band of orcs actually attacked the elven guards that were watching Gollum, and Gollum ended up getting away. And the elves tried to track him, but they lost his trail upon Dol Guldur. And that's all we learn from this passage in the Fellowship of the Ring, but there's a lot of information here. We're starting to be able to piece together the puzzle of what happened to Gollum after The Hobbit and before Lord of the Rings. We learn that Gollum gave information to the hosts of Mordor. We learn that Gollum was released from the captivity of Mordor, likely not with the best of intentions. And then we learn that he's intercepted and brought to Mirkwood for further interrogation. Now, this in itself paints a pretty clear picture of what we could see in this film. We'll likely see Gollum in the custody of Sauron, we'll then see him in the cells of Mirkwood, and then we'll then see him escape to catch up with the events of the Lord of the Rings films. But in this passage, there's still a lot of gaps of what else the story could entail. Luckily, our second source fills in many of these gaps, and it even gives us some hints as to returning characters that we could see in this film. This source is from the Appendices B of Return of the King, better known as the Tale of Years. This section of the Appendices basically runs down bullet points of every major event that happens in the Second and Third Age of Middle-earth in a list format. At the very end of this section, right before we actually get to the bullet points that encompass the Lord of the Rings novels, we get about a half page of bullet points that really expand what we're going to be able to see in this story. The first bullet point tells us that Gollum actually waits 3 whole years to start his search for the ring and leave his cave after his encounter with Bilbo. We then learn that 7 whole years later, Gollum starts to turn his quest toward Mordor, which checks out with Legolas' story that we just reviewed. We then jump 29 years later, the same year that Theoden coincidentally becomes king of Rohan. And we learn that Gollum finally reaches the perimeter of Mordor and actually encounters Shelob for the first time. The fourth bullet point is when things start to get more exciting because it brings us right to the beginning of the Lord of the Rings story at Bilbo's farewell feast, 57 whole years after Gollum first decided to leave his cave. When Gandalf sees Bilbo use his ring and that it turns him invisible, he immediately starts to suspect that this could be the One Ring. So, what does he do? He doubles a guard that he placed around the Shire so that he can go out and seek news of Gollum. And to do this, he calls on Aragorn for help. So, yes, we get news that both Gandalf and Aragorn were involved in tracking down Gollum in the first place, and that they will both very, very likely be in this movie. And I think it's very plausible that we could see Sir Ian McKellen return as Gandalf to the role, because during this time period, Gandalf would have looked very similar to how we've already seen him portrayed on the screen. But I really doubt that we're going to see Viggo Mortensen return as Aragorn. He just looks so much older now, and digitally de-aging him is going to be a really expensive task. Plus, one of the heaviest rumors before the plot of the Rings of Power show was announced that the show is going to follow a young Aragorn. So this is their chance to do that. One major change that the Lord of the Rings films made to the books was that In the books, Frodo actually waits 17 years before leaving the Shire after Bilbo's farewell party. In the movie, no timeline is specified, but it's safe to assume they're not operating under this 17-year span, because in the movie it really feels like only a couple weeks or months before the hobbits get to leave the Shire. So because of all of this, I believe they're going to cast a younger actor as Aragorn and follow the actual timeline from the books. If they go this route, they may have to find a way to raise Gandalf's suspicions a little bit earlier than Bilbo's farewell party to make the decision cohesive with the already existing films, but I think that they could do this. Gandalf and Aragorn were both alive during this 57-year gap between Gollum leaving his cave and Bilbo's party, so they have a lot of time to play with. Going back to the book's timeline, we then learn that Gandalf checks in on Frodo over the years while he's searching for more information about the ring. And after Gandalf pays Frodo his last visit, he and Aragorn spend 8 years in the trenches looking for Gollum all throughout Middle-earth. During this same time is when we learn that Gollum ventures into Mordor and is captured by Sauron. In this passage, we don't hear much of what actually goes on in those conversations, but we'll get to that in the next source. But after another 8 years in captivity, we learn that Gollum is released and is shortly thereafter picked up by Aragorn in the Dead Marshes. Lastly, we learn that Aragorn himself actually brings Gollum into Mirkwood and hands him over to none other than King Thranduil, another returning character that we've actually seen on screen before in the Hobbit movies. In my opinion, it would be an absolute delight to see Lee Pace return to the role of Thranduil because his demeanor and aura perfectly was fit for Tolkien's world. And say what you will about those movies, but he was born to play that part. These bullet points really catch us up to speed on what happens before Gollum's captivity within Mirkwood, and that's where I think most of the movie is going to play out. I believe we'll see the inner turmoil of Gollum and Smeagol trying to convince himself to leave the cave. I believe that we'll see Sauron himself torture Gollum and maybe even strike a deal with him to venture out of Mordor and search for the ring. I believe we'll see a young Aragorn potentially interact with Arwen before he sets out on this quest. And I believe that we could even see Legolas in Mirkwood as Gollum is brought to King Thranduil. The possibilities are truly endless, and it is a great time to be a Lord of the Rings fan. We know that Peter Jackson, Fran Walsh, and Philippa Boyens respect the lore of this world, and they won't make needless changes to Tolkien's words. And that is super refreshing after just having got another Tolkien adaptation where they don't seem to care as much about telling a super faithful story. Don't get me wrong, I didn't mind the show, and I still think there was a lot to love, but it warms my heart knowing that this is in good hands from the get-go. But I did say that we were going to be looking at 3 sources today. And the third source is a lesser-known book that was published after Tolkien's death, and it's called The Unfinished Tales of Numenor and Middle-earth. And this one is tricky because I don't know if the filmmakers will have the rights to this book. I know that they have the rights to Lord of the Rings, the appendices within the Lord of the Rings, but I know that most of the peripheral books are usually off limits for them. It's of little consequence though, because what we learn in Unfinished Tales are mostly the detailing of events rather than events themselves. So we're not going to be missing out on any big chunks of content that aren't included in the original texts. So luckily, the filmmakers should have all they need to accurately portray the events that happen in this story. But what we learn in the Unfinished Tales is still very interesting. We learn that Gollum only gave 2 words of evidence to Sauron, and that was Shire and Baggins. We already know that Gollum was once a halfling, but what we learn here is that he actually wouldn't have known of the word hobbit because it's a local term that's used primarily outside of where he lived when he was of that race. We learn that Sauron assumes that this Baggins is from the same place that Gollum used to live in the Vales of the Anduin, which is one of Sauron's biggest mistakes. He sends his Black Riders there, and this delays them from reaching the Shire weeks sooner. We then learn that after Aragorn captures Gollum in the Dead Marshes, Gandalf actually comes to Mirkwood to question Gollum. And this is where Gollum figures out that Gandalf knew Bilbo, but he didn't know this when he was being tortured by Sauron and being forced to confess. We then learn a little bit more about Aragorn's path to get to Mirkwood from the Dead Marshes, and it turns out it took around 50 days with Gollum as his prisoner. When Aragorn first enters the forests of Mirkwood, this is when the spies of Dol Guldur see that he has Gollum as his prisoner. News of this gets back to Sauron, along with the news that Gandalf has entered the region, and he goes wild. He sends the attack of orcs to recapture and or kill Gollum, it's not really clear, but ultimately it costs him because this is how Gollum gets free. There's another story happening at the same time in this passage of the book where Sauron actually sends another force to attack Osgiliath to open up a bridge for the Nazgul to move more quickly, but I don't think they're going to use that in the movie. However, if it did get used, we could then see the return of Boromir and Faramir, but again, I really don't think it's going to get used. Then finally, when he escapes the elves and the orcs that are both trailing him, we learn that Gollum goes and hides in the mountains of Moria, where all traces of him are lost. So like I say, we learn a lot about about how things happen here, like how Sauron learns that Gollum is being held captive in Mirkwood. But the filmmakers would still be able to portray the orc attack that Sauron launches in response because it's already depicted in Fellowship. It's rumored that this new Hunt for Gollum film won't come out till 2026, but honestly, I can wait. Please take the time, make it right. The fans will absolutely thank you for it. The last thing I'll do here before calling it a day is try to combine all three of these sources to give you an accurate depiction of how the story of this film could play out from start to finish. The event that starts off this story is Gollum finally working up the courage to leave his cave and go after the thief that stole his ring from him. He wanders for quite a bit, but then he starts moving in the direction of Mordor, where he comes upon Shelob for the first time. Not too long after this, Gandalf starts to seriously suspect that Bilbo's ring might be the one, and he enlists Aragorn's help to look for Gollum. But before they can find him, Gollum actually makes his way into Mordor proper and is captured and tortured by Sauron for a full 8 years. However, after he's released by Sauron, Gollum is promptly picked up by Aragorn in the Dead Marshes, and then is taken over a 50-day journey to get to Mirkwood, where he's handed over to King Thranduil. Once Aragorn and Gollum are in Mirkwood, Gandalf also arrives to start questioning Gollum directly, but once he leaves, the elves that are holding Gollum captive start to feel sorry for him and start to take him on walks through the forest and let him start climbing trees. One unlucky afternoon, he refuses to come down from the trees, and a band of orcs comes in and attacks his Mirkwood guards. Gollum is then last seen on the run from both elves and orcs, so he swims across the river Anduin and burrows himself deep in the mountains of Moria, which catches us up to speed from what we've seen in the Lord of the Rings films thus far. So I hope you learned something today about what to expect from this newly announced Lord of the Rings film. Are you excited about this movie? Do you think it's going to be handled properly now that we're back with Peter Jackson, Fran Walsh, and Philippa Boyens? I would love to hear your thoughts in the comments. I had so much fun going back through the texts to make this video, and if you want to stay up to date on my thoughts about this project and other nerdy properties, please like this video and subscribe. It would mean the world to me. Like I said, this is just my third video. Thank you so much if you made it this far. Have a good one.